The war canoe's torch light skidded across black water, and Snaga Strongtusk drove her paddle deep, muscles cording along her bare arms as the reed boat shot beneath a curtain of hanging moss. Behind her, 3 more torches bobbed and swung, voices shouting in the guttural clan tongue she had grown up speaking with pride and now heard only as a death sentence. An arrow hissed past her ear and buried itself in the boat's low prow with a sound like a struck drum. She did not look back. Looking back cost time, and time was the only coin she had left. The channel narrowed, choked with root and reed, and she took it anyway, scraping the boat's belly over submerged wood, praying to no god in particular that the enforcers behind her would not know these secret veins of the delta, as well as she had learned them in 3 desperate days of flight. Water sprayed her face, cold and stinking of mud and rot, and beneath her leather vest her heart hammered so hard she thought the arrow that found her, when it found her, would strike a target already breaking apart on its own. The bank rose suddenly out of the dark, a cluster of stilt-legged houses hunched over the water like old herons, lantern light spilling gold from a single window. She had no plan beyond survival. She drove the boat toward the shadow beneath that lit house and threw herself over the side into water that closed over her head and dragged at her boots. When she surfaced, gasping, a hand closed around her wrist and hauled her up onto a low dock with more strength than she expected from the lean shape crouched above her. "Don't move," the man said, low and even, and there was a blade at her throat before her eyes had even cleared water enough to see his face. "Whoever's chasing you, they're welcome to keep chasing. I want no part of it." She spat river water and looked up past the knife into a face weathered by sun and old scars, a jaw set hard, eyes the gray of storm cloud. Human, of course. She almost laughed, except laughing with a blade at her throat seemed unwise even for her. "Then let them take me," she rasped, "and see how quickly they burn your house down looking for what I carry." The torches were closer now, cutting orange gashes through the moss-hung dark, and the shouting had sharpened into something with direction and purpose. The man's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to her, and something in his face changed. Some old calculation she recognized because she had made it herself 100 times in the war camps. The weighing of danger against danger, the choice between 2 evils when there was no path that held no cost at all. He cursed under his breath, sheathed the knife, and hauled her up onto her feet with the same rough grip. "Under the house," he said. "Now, and if you make a sound, I will let them have you myself." Snaga Strongtusk did not thank him. She simply ran, bent low, water sluicing off her leathers, and slid into the black crawlspace beneath the stilts where mud and crab shells crunched under her palms, and she pressed her back to a piling and waited, breath held, while the torches came on and the shouting rose, and a man's voice above her steady, bored, utterly unbothered, told the searchers that no orc had passed this way, that he had seen nothing but marsh birds startled off the water, and that they were welcome to search his boat if they doubted a man's word, though they had best do it quickly before the tide turned and stranded them all in the mud until morning. She did not know, then, that the man's name was John Sutton. She only knew that his voice did not shake, though hers, hidden in the dark below him with her life balanced on his word, most certainly would have. The torches passed on, grumbling, unconvinced but unwilling to waste more of the night on a marsh full of false trails. Snaga counted 100 heartbeats before she let herself breathe again, and by then the crawlspace above her groaned as the man's weight settled onto the boards, and a moment later his face appeared upside down in the gap where a plank had rotted through, lit from behind by lantern glow. "They are gone," he said. "For now. You had better come up before the crabs decide you are dinner." She climbed up into a single low room built on stilts above the mudflats, all reed matting and driftwood furniture, a single lantern burning low on a table scarred with old knife marks, and a man standing with his arms crossed who looked, in better light, exactly like what she had guessed him to be from his voice alone. A fighter gone quiet, the kind of stillness that came only to men who had once been very good at violence and had chosen with effort to stop. "John Sutton," he said when she only stared at him, dripping onto his floor. "This is my house. You are bleeding on my floor, which I would appreciate you stop doing, and you have not told me your name or why half a war band is hunting you through my marsh at midnight." "Snaga Strongtusk," she said, because there seemed little point in lying to a man who had already risked his life for her sake without knowing it. "And I am bleeding because your marsh has more roots than water." He almost smiled at that. Almost. She watched him catch it and put it away, the way a man puts away a coin he has decided not to spend. "Sit down, Snaga Strongtusk," he said, pulling a stool from beneath the table. "Before you fall down, I have seen enough men bleed out from pride to know the signs." She sat, because her legs had begun to shake in a way that had nothing to do with pride, and everything to do with the arrow wound she had been ignoring for the better part of an hour, torn along her ribs where a shaft had grazed rather than buried, but had bled with the stubbornness of a wound that did not care how brave its owner pretended to be. John Sutton knelt before her without asking permission, without flinching from the sight of orc blood soaking dark through leather, and set to cleaning the wound with hands that were rough and scarred but startlingly gentle. And Snaga Strongtusk, who had faced down war chiefs and outrun her own kin through 100 miles of hostile marsh, found herself holding very still beneath the touch of a human stranger, and wondering, with something that was not quite fear, what exactly she had swum into. The lantern burned low and steady while John worked, and neither of them spoke for a long while, the only sounds the distant croak of marsh frogs and the slow slap of water against the stilts beneath the floor. Snaga watched him from beneath lowered lashes, cataloging him the way she had been trained to catalog any stranger who might become a threat. Broad through the shoulders, though not tall, forearms marked with the pale seams of old scars that had not come from farm work or fishing, a stillness to his hands that spoke of a man who had learned patience the hard way, likely through pain that was not his own. When he finally leaned back and wiped his hands on a rag, she asked the question plainly because she had never seen the use in circling one. "You fight," she said, "or you did." "I did," he said, and offered nothing more, folding the bloody rag with more care than the object deserved. "In the pits." His eyes came up to hers, sharp for a moment, and she felt a small, grim satisfaction at having landed the guess true. "Fort Callan," he admitted. 6 years in the ring, until I killed a man I did not want to kill and decided I had had enough of being paid to hurt people for the amusement of men who never bled a drop themselves. I came here for quiet. I would very much like to keep it." "Then you should not have hidden me," she said. "No," he agreed. "I should not have. I have been telling myself that since the moment I did it." Outside, far off across the black water, a horn sounded once, low and mournful, the kind of signal that meant a search called off for the night rather than abandoned. Snaga's shoulders eased a fraction, though she did not let herself relax entirely. She had learned in 3 days of running that safety was a story men told themselves in the space between one danger and the next. "They will come back," she said. "At dawn, likely, or before." "Then you had better tell me," John Sutton said, sitting back on his heels, "exactly what I have hidden in my house, and why half a clan warband wants it dead badly enough to burn a stranger's marsh looking." She studied him a long moment. In the war camps, trust was a thing measured out in blood debts and years, never given whole to a man met an hour before in the mud beneath his own house. But she had already spent 3 days learning that the old measurements did not hold when a clan turned its spears on one of its own, and she was running out of roads that led anywhere but a knife in the dark. "I carry proof," she said slowly, "that Kraga Ironhide, war captain of my own clan, means to break the truce between our peoples. He plans to stage a raid on a human trading post at the Delta's mouth, dressed as bandits, and let the blame fall on outlaws so the humans retaliate against innocent camps. When the humans strike back in anger, as they will, Kraga will call it proof that no truce with humankind can ever hold, and he will use the war he has built with his own hands to unseat my father as chieftain, and take the warband for himself. John Sutton's face did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still, the way water goes still just before a stone breaks its surface. "Your father," he said, "Grandar Strongtusk, chieftain of the Strongtusk clan for 11 summers. He does not know yet what Kraga plans. I found the orders myself in Kraga's own hand, sealed with his mark, hidden among supply ledgers he thought no one would trouble to read. I took them. Kraga's men caught me before I could reach my father, and I have been running since, because if Kraga's enforcers catch me, the proof burns with me, and no one left alive will ever know the truce was broken on purpose." "Where were you running to?" "Fort Callan," she said. "The treaty keepers there hold the original truce seal. If I bring proof to them, sealed under a human magistrate's witness, Kraga cannot simply claim I lied or that the papers were forged after the fact. It becomes a thing that cannot be unsaid." John Sutton was quiet for a long moment, and Snaga watched him weigh it, watched the calculation move behind his storm-gray eyes, and understood, with a strange lurch in her chest, that she was waiting on the decision of a stranger for whether the next war between their two peoples would be built on a lie or stop before it began. "Fort Callan is 4 days through the Delta channels if you know them," he said finally. "Longer if you do not. And Kraga's enforcers will have every crossing watched by morning." "I know," she said. "I do not have a boat any longer, and I do not know these waters as well as I claim to. I was hoping to steal a little more time in the dark before they found me again. I did not plan on finding you." "No," he said. "I do not imagine you planned on any of this." She reached then into the collar of her sodden leathers and drew out a small disk of polished bone on a leather cord, dark with age, carved with the cross-tusk mark of her clan, and a second smaller mark beneath it that named her, specifically, as blood of the chieftain's line. She had worn it since she was old enough to carry a blade, had never once considered parting with it, because among her people a clan sigil was not decoration. It was a life debt made solid, a claim and a bond both, given only to those a warrior chose to trust with everything, or offered as a dare to see if a stranger had the spine to accept a burden most men would run from. She held it out on her open palm, and John Sutton's eyes went to it, then back to her face, wary. "What is that?" "My clan sigil," she said. "It is not a gift. Among my people, when a warrior presses her sigil into another's hand, it is a claim and a challenge both. It says, I have chosen you to carry my word beside my own. It says, if you take this, you take my fight as yours and I take yours as mine, and there is no walking away from it after, not until the debt between us is settled or one of us is dead. It is not given lightly. I have never given mine to anyone. And you are giving it to me. I am daring you to take it," she said, and there was no softness in her voice, only the flat challenge of a woman who expected to be refused and had steeled herself already against the sting of it. "Because I cannot reach Fort Callan alone, and you know channels I do not, and you have already lied to armed men tonight to buy me an hour I did not deserve. I do not know why you did that. But I need you to do it again for 4 more days, and I will not ask a man to bleed for me on a debt of pity. If you help me because you chose it with open eyes, bound the way my own kind would bind it. Or you do not help me at all, and I take my chances with the water and the dark, as I have been doing." She pressed the bone disc into his palm and closed his fingers around it herself, her hand wrapped over his, warm despite the cold marsh water still dripping from both of them, and she held his gaze the way she had held the gazes of war chiefs twice her size, unflinching, daring him to look away first. John Sutton did not look away. He looked at her for a long, long moment, this stranger with mud in her hair and blood drying on her ribs and a fire behind her eyes that had not gone out despite 3 days of running for her life, and something in him, something that had gone quiet and careful since Fort Callan, since the ring, since the man he had not wanted to kill woke up and leaned forward to meet her. His fingers closed slowly around the sigil, folding it into his fist, and he held it there, held her gaze, and said, in a voice rougher than he meant it to be, "Then I am choosing it. Eyes open." Something passed between them in that instant that neither had a name for yet, a current under still water, and Snaga Strongtusk, who had expected refusal, who had built her whole plan around the likelihood of refusal, felt the ground shift beneath a heart she had thought long since armored past surprising. "Then we leave before first light," she said, pulling her hand back before it could linger, before either of them could examine too closely what had just passed between their palms. "And you should know, John Sutton, that I do not thank easily, but I will not forget this." "Keep the thanks," he said, tucking the sigil beneath his shirt against his chest, where she noticed with a small, unwilling thrill that he chose to wear it rather than set it aside. "Just do not get us both killed before Fort Callan. I only just got used to sleeping through the night." They left before dawn, poling a flat-bottomed reed boat John kept hidden beneath a fall of hanging vine, out into channels that ran black and silent between walls of cypress and moss, the delta waking slowly around them in a chorus of birdsong, and the distant complaint of some large, unseen thing sliding off a mudbank into deeper water. Snaga sat in the boat's prow with the stolen ledger pages wrapped in oilcloth against her chest, and John poled from the stern, and for the first hour neither of them spoke, both listening for the sound of pursuit that did not yet come. It was John who broke the silence, guiding the boat around a fallen log slick with algae. "You said your father does not know. Why not send word ahead instead of carrying the proof yourself?" "Because Kraga controls every runner and rider who might carry such a message," she said. "He has spent 2 years placing his own men in every post between our camp and my father's ear. A message would be intercepted and burned before it traveled a single mile. I am the only one Kraga has not yet managed to silence, and only because I ran before his men could close the net. And if we reach Fort Callan, what happens then? The treaty keepers witness the proof, seal it, and send riders to my father under their own protection, which even Kraga will not dare attack outright, not with human witnesses watching. It is the only road left that does not end in a war neither of our peoples wants, but that Kraga very much does." John was quiet, poling steadily, the boat cutting a silver seam through still water. "And what happens to you after, when this is done?" She had not let herself think that far. "I do not know," she admitted, and it cost her something to say it. "Perhaps my father names me traitor for exposing his war captain and shaming the clan before humans. Perhaps he thanks me and I am welcomed home a hero. I have stopped being certain which is more likely. For what it is worth," John said, "I think a woman who swims into a stranger's marsh at midnight carrying proof that might stop a war does not sound much like a traitor to me." She looked back at him over her shoulder, surprised by the plain kindness of it, unused to hearing anything but suspicion from human mouths, and found him watching the water ahead rather than her, as though he had not meant the words to land with any particular weight, though they had. "You are strange, John Sutton," she said, "for a man who wanted no part of any of this." "I am beginning to notice that myself," he said, and did not explain further, and she let it lie, though she found herself smiling just slightly where he could not see it. They traveled the channels for the better part of 2 days, sleeping in short shifts on narrow mud islands beneath tents of woven reed, sharing a single bowl of stew boiled over a hidden fire, close enough in the small boat that Snaga could feel the warmth of John's shoulder against her own, whenever the current forced them together, and she found herself, more than once, leaning into that warmth a heartbeat longer than the boat's rocking required, and catching him doing the same. On the second evening, they passed a stilt village clinging to a wide bend in the river, houses on tall pilings strung together with rope walkways, lantern light glowing gold in windows, and the smell of wood smoke and drying fish thick on the air. John steered them toward the village dock, saying they needed dry stores and word of the water ahead, and Snaga tucked her hood low over her tusks and her braided hair, though she knew, even as she did it, that no hood in the world would hide what she was from anyone who looked twice. They had barely tied off the boat when a woman on the dock screamed the word orc loud enough to carry across the whole village, and within the space of 10 heartbeats, a crowd had gathered at the water's edge. Men with fish spears and boat hooks, a boy with an old crossbow too heavy for his arms, all of them shouting, all of them afraid, the particular ugly fear of people who have buried kin in wars they did not start and did not choose. "She is a raider," someone shouted. "Kill her before she calls down her war band on the whole village." "She is with me," John Sutton said, stepping between Snaga and the crowd, both hands raised empty, but his voice carrying the flat, unbothered authority of a man who had once stood in a fighting ring and made larger crowds than this one go quiet. "She has done nothing to any of you. She carries proof that will stop a war, not start one, and if any man here raises a spear against her, he raises it against me first. You would die for an orc," a heavy-set man spat, stepping closer, spear leveled. "I would," John said, and there was no hesitation in it at all, and Snaga, standing at his back with her heart hammering and her hand on the hilt of her knife, felt something crack open inside her chest at the plain, unadorned certainty of it. "But you do not have to find out today. Ask anyone who fought the Fort Callan Pitts 8 summers past who John Sutton is, and think carefully before you decide tonight is the night to test whether I have gotten slow." The heavy-set man's eyes flicked, and someone in the crowd murmured the name Sutton with a note of recognition, and the spear lowered a fraction, and then a fraction more, and slowly, grudgingly, the crowd's fury cooled into something closer to wary silence. "We want no trouble," the village headman said at last, an older man who pushed forward through the crowd with the weary authority of someone used to keeping peace between frightened neighbors. "But we will not have her sleeping under our roofs, Sutton. Take your supplies and go before full dark." "That is all I ask," John said, and it was enough, and the crowd broke apart slowly, muttering, throwing glances back at Snaga that were not kind but were, at least, no longer murderous. They left the village with dry stores and a coil of new rope and no further trouble, and it was not until they were a mile downstream, the village lights fading behind them, that Snaga finally spoke. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly. "Stand in front of a mob for me. You could have let them believe I was a raider and walked away clean." "I could have," John agreed, poling steadily through the dark. "I did not want to." "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "Because somewhere in the last 2 days," he said finally, "I stopped thinking of you as a problem I got tangled up in, and started thinking of you as someone I would very much regret losing. I am not sure when that happened, but I know it happened, and I am not interested in pretending otherwise." Snaga Strongtusk, who had faced down chieftains and outrun war bands and pressed her own clan's sigil into a stranger's hand without her voice shaking once, found that she had no ready answer for that at all, and sat very still in the dark, listening to the water and her own too loud heart, until John eased the boat toward a dry hummock and said gruffly that they should make camp before the light went entirely. That night, beneath a lean-to of woven reeds with a small fire burning low between them, Snaga finally asked him the question she had been circling since the marsh. "Who was the man you killed, John Sutton, in the ring?" He did not answer at once, feeding a stick into the fire, watching the flame catch. "A boy, really. 19 summers, maybe 20. Fought under the name Iron Colt, though his real name was Dennis. He needed the coin worse than I ever did, and the crowd wanted blood, and I gave it to them because that was the job, and I told myself for years that it was not my fault, that the fault belonged to the men who ran the ring and sold tickets to watch 2 desperate men try to kill each other for coin. But I was the one who threw the last blow. I have carried that a long time, and you came here to stop carrying it." "I came here because I did not know how else to stop," he said. "The marsh does not care what I used to be. The fish do not care. It seemed at the time like the only quiet left in the world. And now," he looked up at her across the fire, and the light caught the gray of his eyes and turned them warm instead of stormy. "Now I am not so certain quiet was ever what I wanted," he said. "I think I only wanted someone worth breaking it for." She crossed the small space between them before either of them had decided, consciously, that she would, and knelt before him in the firelight. And when he did not pull away, when his hand came up instead to rest against her jaw with a gentleness that undid her far more thoroughly than any blade ever had, she closed the last distance herself and kissed him, fierce and hungry and long overdue, and felt him answer in kind, one hand fisting gently in her braided hair, the other still. She realized distantly, closed around the bone sigil beneath his shirt as though he meant never to let it go. When they finally broke apart, breathless, foreheads pressed together in the flickering dark, Snaga laughed low in her throat, a sound of disbelief more than mirth. "This is forbidden, you know," she murmured. "My father would call this madness. Kraga would call it worse." "Then it is fortunate," John said, "that neither of them is here." They did not speak of it further that night, though neither of them slept far from the other's side, and in the morning they poled on toward Fort Callan with something new and fragile and fiercely alive settled quietly between them, unspoken but no longer deniable. On the third day, disaster found them at the worst possible crossing. They had reached a place where the delta narrowed into a single channel, spanned by an old rope-end plank bridge strung between two stilt platforms, the only crossing for miles that would save them a full day's detour around a bend choked with deadfall. They were halfway across, John in the lead with the ledger pages strapped tight to his back, Snaga behind him with one hand on the guide rope, when a horn sounded from the far bank, and Kraga's enforcers broke from the tree line in a dead run, blades drawn, 6 of them, faster than either John or Snaga had dared hope they would be. "Run!" Snaga shouted, and they did, boots pounding on rain-slicked planks, the bridge swaying wildly beneath them, and behind them the enforcers' war cries rose up over the rush of water below, and above that, worse, a groaning creak of old rope giving way beneath too much sudden weight and violence. The plank beneath John's foot cracked and dropped away entirely, and he lurched forward, catching the guide rope with one hand, boots skating over open air above a churning flood-swollen river far below, the storm runoff from the hills having turned what should have been a lazy channel into a brown, roaring torrent studded with broken branches. "John!" Snaga's voice cracked with a fear she had not let herself show once in 3 days of running for her life, and she threw herself forward along the swaying, disintegrating bridge, plank by plank giving way behind her heels, until she reached him and closed both hands around his wrist, orc strength straining against the drag of his full weight and the pull of the current below. "The ledger," he gasped, boots finding no purchase. "If I go in, the proof goes with me." "I am not losing you to save paper," she snarled, and hauled, muscles screaming, feet braced against a plank that groaned in protest. And for one endless heartbeat it seemed the whole bridge would simply take them both down into the flood together. Then the rope held, just long enough, and John's free hand found the edge of the platform ahead, and between his own scrabbling strength and the brute, furious pull of Snaga's grip, he heaved himself up and over the lip of broken planking, the two of them collapsing together in a tangle of limbs, as, behind them, the last of the bridge tore loose entirely and fell in a great crashing spray into the river below, taking 2 of Kraga's pursuing enforcers down into the flood with it, their war cries turning to shouts of alarm as the current swept them under. The remaining enforcers, stranded now on the far bank with no crossing left, screamed curses across the widening gap of churning water, but there was nothing left for them to do but watch as John Sutton and Snaga Strongtusk lay gasping and soaked and alive on the far platform, her hand still locked around his wrist as though she had not yet convinced herself he was safe. "You could have let go of the ledger," she said, when she finally found her breath, fury and terror still shaking through her voice. "You could have let it fall and saved yourself." "I know," he said. "Why didn't you?" "Because it was not only the ledger I was thinking of falling," he said quietly, and she understood, with a fierce ache in her chest, that he had meant to hold on for her sake at least as much as the proofs, and something in her that had been braced and armored since the moment she fled her own camp finally, quietly, broke open. She kissed him again there on the broken platform, soaked and trembling and alive, uncaring that Kraga's men still shouted curses from the far bank, and when they finally pulled apart, she pressed her forehead to his and said, low and rough, "Do not do that again." "I will try," John said, "not to fall off any more bridges on your behalf, though I make no promises." They made camp early that night, exhausted and bruised, on a dry rise above the water where the enforcers, stranded on the wrong side of a river now too swollen and swift to cross safely, could not easily follow until morning at earliest. John built a small fire and Snaga sat close against his side beneath a shared blanket, and this time, when their hands found each other in the firelight, neither of them pulled away, and what began as comfort after fear became something slower and warmer and entirely unhurried. Two people who had nearly lost each other choosing instead, quietly and deliberately, to hold on. She told him that night the rest of what she had not yet said. That Kraga had once sought to marry her himself, years before, to bind the war captain's line closer to the chieftain's, and that her refusal had been the first crack in whatever fragile respect had existed between them. That some part of Kraga's hunger to break the human truce was also, she suspected, a hunger to prove that the clan's future belonged to him and not to her father's softer, more peaceable line. So this was never only about the truce, John said. No, she admitted. It is about power, as these things always are, dressed up as something nobler. But that does not make the war he would start any less real or any less bloody for the people who would have to fight it and die in it on both sides. John was quiet a moment, watching the fire. "When we reach Fort Callan," he said, "and this is done, whatever happens with your father, with your clan, I want you to know that I am not walking away after. I did not choose this." And here he drew the bone sigil out from beneath his shirt, turning it in the firelight, lightly. "I meant it when I closed my hand around it. I still mean it. Even knowing what it costs," she said. "Even knowing my own people may never accept you, that yours may never accept me. Even knowing that," he said. "I spent 6 years in a ring being told what I was worth by men who never once looked at me as anything but a weapon for hire. I have not felt chosen by anyone in a very long time, Snaga. I am not interested in giving that up because it might be difficult." She studied his face in the firelight, this quiet, scarred, stubborn man who had thrown himself between her and a mob's spears, who had nearly gone into a flood rather than abandon proof that was not even his fight, who wore her clan's sigil against his heart like it belonged there. And she found, to her own faint astonishment, that she believed him entirely. "Then we finish this together," she said. "And whatever comes after, comes after." They reached Fort Callan on the morning of the 4th day, the palisade walls rising grim and gray above the delta mist, human guards atop the walkways eyeing their small reed boat with open suspicion long before it touched the dock. Word of an orc woman and a former pit fighter traveling together had apparently outrun them, carried by riders from the Stilt village or by rumor alone, and by the time they climbed onto the dock, a small crowd had already gathered, along with 2 armed guards and worse, a rider bearing the cross-tusk banner of Kraga Ironhide himself, arrived ahead of them by a faster overland route Snaga had not accounted for. "That is her," the rider called out, pointing. "The chieftain's daughter fled from justice after murdering 2 of the war captain's own men on the Delta Road. She carries forged papers meant to slander a loyal war captain and drag our clans back into war. I demand she be held for the Strongtusk clan's judgment." A murmur of alarm rippled through the gathered crowd, and Snaga felt the old, familiar tightening in her chest, the sensation of ground shifting treacherously beneath her feet even as John Sutton stepped up beside her, solid and unmoving, one hand closing briefly, deliberately, over hers. "He lies," Snaga said, loud enough to carry, though her voice did not shake. "I killed no one. Your own war captain's men attacked us at a bridge crossing 3 days south of here, and 2 of them drowned in the flood their own violence caused. I carry no forgery. I carry proof, in Kraga Ironhide's own sealed hand, of a plan to stage a false raid on this very post and lay the blame on innocent bandits, so that when your people retaliate in anger, he can call the truce dead and seize my father's seat through the war he engineered himself. Lies from a fugitive, the writer spat. Then let the treaty keepers judge for themselves, John Sutton said, stepping forward, his voice carrying the same flat, unhurried authority that had quieted the mob at the Stilt village. There is a magistrate behind this wall sworn to hold the original truce seal. Let him examine the papers she carries and the war captain's own mark upon them, and let him judge whether they are forged, rather than settling the matter here on a dock with spears and shouting. The crowd's murmur shifted, uncertain now, torn between old fear of orcs and the plain, steady reasonableness of a human voice they recognized. A few of the older townsfolk murmuring John Sutton's name to one another with the particular respect reserved for men once famous in the fighting ring. The magistrate, summoned from within the walls by an anxious guard, proved to be an older man with ink-stained fingers and a face schooled to careful neutrality, and he examined the oilcloth-wrapped ledger pages for a long, tense while in the open square, comparing the war captain's seal pressed into the wax against a record of known clan marks kept in the fort's own archive, while the crowd waited in a silence so thick Snaga could hear her own pulse in her ears. "The seal is genuine," the magistrate said finally, looking up. "Kraga Ironhide's own mark, pressed into orders describing a staged raid upon this very post, dated 11 days past. This is not forgery. This is treason against the truce, plain and undeniable." The rider who had ridden ahead to accuse her went pale and turned his horse as though to flee, but the fort's guards closed around him before he could, and the crowd's murmur turned slowly, from suspicion of Snaga into a low, ugly anger aimed now at the absent war captain, who had nearly dragged them all back into a war on a lie. "Riders will be sent to Chieftain Grondar Strongtusk under my own seal and escort," the magistrate said, "so that no one may claim this proof was altered after the fact. The truce holds, for now." Relief washed through Snaga so fiercely her knees nearly buckled, and it was John's hand, steady at her elbow, that kept her upright, and she leaned into him without shame in front of the whole watching square, done, for once, with hiding what he had come to mean to her. It took 11 more days for word to travel to her father's camp and back, 11 days in which Snaga and John waited at Fort Callan under the wary, but no longer hostile eye of the garrison, sharing a small room above the trading post, no longer needing to hide the growing warmth between them though they moved carefully still, aware of watching eyes on both sides of an old, uneasy divide. On the 11th night, with the truce's fate still hanging unresolved, Snaga came to him at last without pretense, without the excuse of shared warmth against cold or fear, and told him plainly that she wanted him, had wanted him since the marsh, since the fire, since the moment his hand closed around her sigil and did not let go. And John Sutton, who had spent years believing himself a man built only for violence and quiet, learned that night what it was to be wanted so fiercely, and so openly, that all his old careful armor simply had nowhere left to stand. What passed between them was slow where the danger around them had been fast, tender where the world outside had been sharp-edged, and when it was over they lay tangled together in the dark, her head against his chest, his fingers tracing idle patterns along her shoulder, and neither of them spoke for a long while because there was, for once, nothing that needed saying that their bodies had not already said. Word finally came on the 12th day. Chieftain Grondar Strongtusk, presented with proof sealed under human witness and unable to deny his own war captain's mark, had stripped Kraga Ironhide of rank and cast him out from the clan in disgrace before the assembled warband, an exile rather than an execution only because Grondar, mindful of the fragile truce, wished no further blood spilled that might be twisted into new grievance. The truce held, stronger for having survived the test. And Snaga Strongtusk, chieftain's daughter who had exposed her own clan's treason, and in doing so, saved a fragile peace between two peoples who had spent generations learning to hate each other, found herself summoned to her father's camp to answer for what she had done, and to answer, too, for the human man she had brought with her, wearing her sigil openly against his chest for anyone with eyes to see. The war camp received them with wary silence, warriors lining the approach with arms folded and faces carved from old suspicion, and Snaga walked through them with her chin high and John Sutton at her side, matching her step for step, though every instinct in him screamed that a lone human walking into an orc war camp was a man walking toward his own funeral. Chieftain Grondar Strongtusk met them before his great hide tent, a mountain of a man even by orc standards, tusks capped in worn silver, eyes that held both the weight of 11 years of leadership and, when they found his daughter, something rower and more frightened than any war council had ever drawn from him. "You could have died," he said before anything else, his voice cracking on the words. "Alone in the Delta, running from your own clan's blade, and I would not have known until it was far too late to matter." "I did not die," Snaga said, "because of him." Grondar's eyes moved to John Sutton, taking in the sigil at his throat with an expression Snaga could not read, something between insult and consideration warring behind his heavy brow. "You gave a human our clan's mark," he said slowly. "Do you understand what that means, Snaga? Among our people, that is not a small thing. That is a claim before every warrior who has ever worn a Strongtusk sigil, that this man's blood and yours are bound now, debt for debt, until death parts the ledger." "I understand exactly what it means," Snaga said, standing straighter, unflinching before her own father's judgment the way she had stood unflinching before mobs and floods and Kraga's blades alike. "I gave it knowing what it meant. He accepted it knowing what it meant. He has bled for that claim already, Father, at a bridge that nearly took his life along with the proof that saved our clan's honor and this fragile truce both. I will not apologize for choosing him. I would choose him again." The war camp had gone utterly silent, every warrior present holding their breath for the chieftain's answer, and John Sutton, standing very still beside the woman who had claimed him before her own father and every spear in that camp, found that his hand had gone, without his quite deciding it, to rest against the small of her back, a small, steadying gesture of solidarity that did not go unnoticed by the watching warriors. Grondar Strongtusk studied the human man for a long moment, and something in his weathered face slowly, grudgingly, eased. "You stood between my daughter and a bridge collapsing into flood," he said, "and did not let go of her, nor of the proof that saved this clan's honor. You stood before a mob of your own people and told them you would die before you let harm come to an orc woman. This is not the behavior of a man who claimed a sigil lightly." "I did not claim it lightly," John said, his voice steady though his heart hammered fit to burst through his ribs. "I do not know your customs well, Chieftain Strongtusk. But I know what I felt the night your daughter pressed that bone into my palm and dared me to close my fist around it. I felt chosen, for the first time in longer than I care to admit. I am not interested in unchoosing her now, whatever it costs me among your people or my own." The chieftain was silent a long, weighted moment, and then, to the visible astonishment of half the watching war camp, he laughed, a great rolling sound that broke the tension like a dropped stone shattering still water. "Then it seems," Grondar said, "my daughter has chosen a mate with more spine than half the warband she grew up beside. Very well. The bond is claimed and witnessed. I will not stand against what my own daughter has already decided, especially not when the man in question has already bled twice over proving he means to keep the debt." A murmur ran through the gathered warriors, not entirely approving, old prejudice not so easily undone by a single chieftain's blessing, but neither was it the murder-thick silence that had greeted their arrival, and Snaga felt, for the first time since fleeing her own camp, the tight coil of dread in her chest finally begin, slowly, to unwind. They stayed 3 more days at the war camp while the clan settled into its new order beneath a chastened, wiser Grandar. And though not every warrior warmed to the human in their midst, none dared openly challenge a bond sealed by the chieftain's own daughter and blessed, however grudgingly, by the chieftain himself. John Sutton bore the wary looks with the same quiet patience he had once brought to the fighting ring, and slowly, over those 3 days, a handful of warriors thought enough to speak with him directly, curious despite themselves about the human who had swum, quite literally, into their clan's deepest crisis, and come out the other side still standing. When they finally left the war camp, it was not back toward Fort Callan but back toward the Delta, toward the stilt house on its lonely pilings above the mudflats where Snaga had first swum, bleeding, into John Sutton's life. A season passed. The rains that had once flooded the channel and torn down the rope bridge gave way to the long dry warmth of late summer, and the Delta settled into its slower rhythms, herons stalking the shallows, cypress trees dripping fresh green moss, the water running low and lazy and gold in the evening light. John Sutton's stilt house had grown, board by board, plank by plank, into something larger than the single room it had once been. A second room added on with Snaga's own hands doing half the work, her orc strength making short work of timber that would have taken John twice as long alone, and a wide covered porch built out over the water where they had taken, most evenings, to sitting together and watching the sun go down red and gold over the reeds. The stilt village nearest them, the same one whose mob had once raised spears against her, had come slowly around. First through the plain necessity of trade, Snaga's strength made her worth more in a single afternoon of hauling nets and clearing deadfall than 3 men together. And the village headman, however grudgingly, had learned to value that over old fear, and later through something closer to genuine welcome. Children who had once fled screaming at the sight of her tusks, now daring each other to be the first to wave from the dock when her boat passed. John had traded his old solitary trapping runs for something steadier, a small ferry service between the stilt village and Fort Callan that he ran with Snaga at his side, her presence at the pole, and the tiller drawing curious trade from Delta folk who had heard, by now, the story of the orc woman and the pit fighter who had stopped a war between them, and who wanted, if only for a morning's passage, to see the pair for themselves. On an evening near the end of that first season together, with the sky over the Delta bruising into deep purple and gold and the frogs beginning their nightly chorus in the reeds, Snaga Strongtusk sat on the wide porch of the house they had built together, her back against John's chest, his arms loose around her waist, and drew the bone sigil out from where it still hung, warm from his skin, against his heart. "Do you know," she said, turning it slowly between her fingers, "that among my people, when the claim a sigil marks is finally settled, when both sides agree the debt runs even, that neither owes the other anything more than love freely given, the one who received the sigil is meant to give it back, not as a rejection, as a completion. It says, I no longer hold you only by debt. I hold you now because I choose to, plainly, with nothing owed between us." John was quiet a moment, his chin resting against the top of her head. "And do you think our debt runs even now?" "I think," she said, turning in his arms to face him properly, the last light of evening catching gold in her eyes, "that you have paid it 100 times over. At the marsh, at the bridge, before my own father's war camp. I do not think there is a debt left between us at all, John Sutton. I think there is only this." She lifted the cord over his head and pressed the sigil back into his palm, folding his fingers over it a second time, the same gesture as that first desperate night in the marsh, except now there was no fear in it, no dare thrown down to see if he would flinch, only a quiet, fierce certainty that had grown, season by season, into something neither war nor flood nor old prejudice had managed to break. "Keep it anyway," she said softly. "Not because you owe me anything, because I want you to have it. Because you are the only one I have ever wanted to give it to, debt or no debt, and I would rather you carry it as a man who is loved than a man who is claimed." John Sutton closed his fist around the sigil one more time, the same motion, the same steady weight of bone against his palm, and held her gaze exactly as he had that first night, though everything about the moment had changed utterly, fear worn away into something warm and lasting and entirely their own. "I will carry it," he said, "for as long as you will have me." "That," Snaga Strongtusk said, leaning in to kiss him slow and sure in the last light of a delta evening, the water lapping gently at the stilts below them, the whole wide rugged world finally, blessedly quiet around the two of them, may turn out to be a very long time indeed. And beneath a sky gone deep violet and gold, on a porch built by two sets of hands that had once belonged to strangers and now belonged wholly to each other, the orc woman and the retired pit fighter sat together as the frogs sang, and the tide came slow and certain up the channel, no longer running from anything, no longer alone, held together by a claim that had begun as a dare and ended, season by season, as the truest kind of home either of them had ever found.